Hello everyone, it's Mr. Sean with your quick hit for chapter 2, dealing with culture and gender. The entire chapter is dealing with culture and gender. This particular quick hit's going to touch on both of those a little bit and give you some concepts that may not be discussed in the textbook that could show up on a future exam, or just some concepts that I want to go over a little bit more in depth. The first one is the concept of in-group, out-group, and this is right at the beginning of the chapter. When we talk about this idea of in-group and out-group when it comes to culture, remember the out-group is the culture that you're not a part of, or the group of people who you don't identify with, whereas the in-group is the group of people who you do identify with. When we talk about in-group versus out-group, every single one of you listening to this quick hit, including myself, we all have various in-groups that we are a part of. Sometimes those in-groups, the principles, the beliefs, the values of those in-groups can actually interfere with each other. And then the question becomes, how do we as people, or how do you as a person, then handle that? How do you communicate that to other people? What if other people are making fun of, or they have hatred towards an out group that is actually your second or third in group? When we talk about an in group, these are just the people that you identify with. So in groups can be certain genders, in groups can be certain races, in groups can be certain political leanings, in groups could even be the high school that you went a part of, or just even the school district. Everybody that goes to Klein ISD, the in group can either be, for example, Klein High School or Klein ISD. So you can see how in group, out group can actually affect you in many different ways. But the one thing I want you to be aware of, when we look at your in group, and once again, I hate to bring this up, and I'm seeing a lot of this lately when it comes to society, is that if you're not part of someone's in group, then you see this aggression towards those who are part of the out group. And they're aggressive because they are part of that out group and not within the in group. And then we can gain some sort of bias for people who are solely in our in group. We may not know anything about them. We may not know anything about their past, but because they belong to the same political party as me, because they belong to the same high school, because they belong to the same race, because they belong to the same college that I go to or that you go to, you can hold a positive attitude towards that person without even getting to know who they are and what they really stand for. So culture in and of itself, I took this definition from a textbook a couple of years ago, and I think it encapsulates culture very well. It's just a specialized element of the lifestyle of a group of people that are passed from one generation to the next through communication. So remember, when it comes to culture, you are not born with culture. Do not get this twisted. Do not get this confused. You can be born into a culture, but that doesn't mean you are born into culture. We have to learn about culture through communication. That might sound a bit confusing, so I'll give you this example. Let's say you are Hispanic, or even white, or even black, or Asian, or Middle Eastern, things of that nature. It doesn't matter which race or ethnicity you are. Does every race or ethnicity have the same story? Does every race or ethnicity have the same background when it comes to living in the United States? Does every race or ethnicity knows what it means to be of that same race or ethnicity? If you're Hispanic, I guarantee you Hispanics who come from the Valley have a different life story and journey than Hispanics of West Texas. Not only that, if you're Hispanic in California, that's a different culture than Hispanics in the state of Texas or Hispanics in the state of Florida. So, as I said before, you learn about your culture, you learn about your culture through communication. Similarly, when you learn about your culture through communication, sometimes it can be deceiving and sometimes it can be misleading. And what I mean by that is this. There are certain parts of your past that maybe your family did not want you to know, or there are certain parts of the past that your family is embarrassed by, or they just don't want you to think that that is who you are culturally. So they deliberately don't communicate that side or that story to you. I had a student a couple of years ago who told me that he just recently found out that his family had owned slaves. And that's something that his family was embarrassed about. So his relatives did not mention that at all. So he thought that they never did. And then when he did his family research, it was as Ancestry.com was coming out with that thing. And as he did that, that's what he found out about his great-great-great-grandparents. And that just boggled his mind. He couldn't believe it. But he was more upset at his relatives, specifically his mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, for not revealing that to him because they were too embarrassed that that actually happened in their family. So when we talk about this idea of culture, how is culture communicated or passed on from one generation to the next? Inculturation is the native culture that you're born into, whereas acculturation is the culture that you learn about. So take this to know that it's different from assimilation. When you talk about assimilation, that means you should forcefully conform or adjust to a certain group. So the question I want to ask you, and I want you to think about while going through this chapter, should immigrants that are allowed to come to the United States of America, or should immigrants who come to the United States of America, should they practice acculturation, or should they practice assimilation? Remember, with assimilation, you're leaving your native culture behind and you're adapting to the current culture that you're in. Whereas with acculturation, you're learning the rules and norms of your host culture, aka the new culture that you're a part of, but you're still celebrating elements of your own culture, of your native culture. When we talk about communication and culture, understand that there are two differences. There's an individualistic and a collectivistic culture. The individualistic is more about personal freedoms, high value on the individual, whereas the collectivistic culture places a high value on the group. When you talk about the individualistic culture, these cultures understand more about power and freedoms, not necessarily understand more, but this is what they preach. Think about our political parties here in the United States of America. The Republican Party, one of their key platforms and principles is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is a metaphor for you are an individual, you can do it individually, you do not need the help of anyone else. Whereas collectivistic cultures, they want more value to be placed on the group itself for this group cohesion and for this group harmony. This idea of you need to be weary of and watchful for the entire group. As long as you are watchful for the entire group is successful. The entire family, the entire culture is successful if that's your mindset going into what it is that you're doing. So you see which cultures are individualistic and collectivistic. And I encourage you to read more about this as you're analyzing this, as you're reading this particular chapter. But when you look at the individualistic and collectivistic cultures, sure, we here in the United States are individualistic, and some of you might come from other cultures that are collectivistic, but on the whole, every culture has bits and pieces of the other one within your culture. What I mean by that is this. The United States is considered an individualistic culture, but there are certain things that each one of us does in our life that takes an element from the collectivistic nature. So on the whole, yes, we're individualistic, but we can also take bits and pieces from the collectivistic culture while still remaining individualistic. And then the final thing I want you to be aware of when it comes to this chapter is ethnocentrism and culture shock. Remember, ethnocentrism or ethnocentristic, meaning you are assuming that your culture is better than others or more superior than others. The example I always give when I teach this class is Texas. We think we're the best state in the United States. No other state is better than us. Our food is better. Our culture is better. We're so awesome here in the state of Texas. We don't even consider ourselves part of a certain area of the United States. What I mean by that is this. Texas doesn't consider itself part of the Deep South. Texas doesn't even consider itself Southern. Texas doesn't consider itself Southwest. We consider ourselves Texas. And there's a lot of people that live in this state that believe we as Texans are better than any other state within the United States. But ethnocentrism can also play a role when it comes to culture as well. This nationalism that could possibly be thought of as ethnocentristic because it's the idea that this particular country, no matter if it's the United States, Canada, Ireland, what have you, is better than any other country. And when we talk about ethnocentrism, that's not necessarily a good thing. But ethnocentrism can also be in the most shallow of shallow things. For example, I went to UT. I'm a Longhorn. It could be considered ethnocentrism if I believe that the University of Texas is better than any other college or university on the face of this earth. That is a form of ethnocentrism. You have engaged in a form of ethnocentrism based upon the high school that you went to. Your high school is better than your rival high school, and anybody who goes to your rival high school is trash, where you are the most awesome person and you come from the most awesome high school in the world. So we always believe that our own culture is normal, and that plays into ethnocentrism because the culture that we are part of is normal and it's everyone else who has a screwed up culture. And that plays a role into chapter 3, dealing with communication in the self. And students always ask, well, why is it that we look at it through that particular lens, that our own culture is normal and it's everyone else who's screwed up? And my simple answer is this: because we as human beings wouldn't dare be part of a culture which we knew was purposely messed up. So therefore, it's buried in the subconscious that what our culture is and the cultures and co-cultures that we are a part of, we are the normal ones and know it's everyone else that's messed up. And sometimes this can lead to culture shock. I don't know if you've watched the TV show The Amazing Race. I wish this was my face-to-face class. I can't show it for copyright purposes here on the Quick Hit, but there is I'll try to post it to the discussion board if I can remember to do that. There is a clip of course, the Amazing Race contestants. The two are from Texas, but they are going through this festival of colors in India, and they're being pelted with colored powder because in celebration of this festival. And you could just hear them say, "This is dreadful. Why would anybody want to do that?" That's an element of culture shock. We experience culture shock a lot, especially as Americans when we go overseas, because our first instinct is, why don't they do it the way that we do it? And when you say the way that we do it, we is the culture that you come from. Because, as I said before, our own culture is normal. This happens a lot. I travel internationally a lot, and you can tell when there are other Americans in the building because they can sometimes look at the culture that they're in and say, I don't understand why they do it like this. Why don't they just have this like we have in America? That could be an element of culture shock. So when we go through culture shock, and I want you to ask yourself, have I been through culture shock before? It's just we're putting a new cultural situation, and what we're accustomed to, what we're used to, has now been disrupted. We're used to a certain way or a certain thing or it being like this. It could be so simple as you going to the Starbucks, the same Starbucks every single day, getting your same coffee, and you know exactly how they're going to prepare it because they know you and you know them. Well, if you go to a Starbucks in another country, they might not wait on you nearly as good. They might not make the drink nearly as good as what you're accustomed to here in Texas. And that can be an element of culture shock. Why? Because your own customs, your own norms have been disrupted. So that was your quick hit for chapter 2, dealing with culture. I look forward to seeing your responses on this particular discussion board.